Countries with the most human trafficking. Number 1. Thailand. Thailand is one of the world's top countries for human trafficking. The country is a hub for women and children trafficked from neighboring Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, who are often sold into the sex trade or forced to work in exploitative labor conditions. In addition, there are reports of Thailand being a transit country for victims from other countries in Southeast Asia, as well as Central and South Asia, and even Africa. Forced labor is also a major human trafficking problem in Thailand, and accounts for the majority of victims. People are forced to work in the country's fishing and seafood industries, as well as in garment and textile factories. Furthermore, Thailand is a destination country for victims of forced marriage, many of whom are women and girls. The Thai government has taken steps to address the issue in recent years, including the passage of a comprehensive anti-trafficking law, but there is still much work to be done. Number 2. China. China is widely regarded as one of the countries with the most significant human trafficking issue. In recent years, the Chinese government has taken steps to fight trafficking, such as introducing legislation to protect victims, setting up anti-trafficking initiatives, and providing funding for shelters and other victim support programs. However, much of the problem remains hidden or difficult to address, due to the lack of data and legal protection for the victims. The International Labour Organization, ILO, estimates that there are over 10 million people in China who are victims of human trafficking and other forms of exploitation. The majority of these are women and children, who are often victims of forced labor, sexual exploitation, or domestic servitude. Many of these victims come from rural areas in China, or from neighboring Southeast Asian countries, and are promised good jobs or education opportunities, only to end up being exploited. This can include physical and sexual abuse, and an inability to leave their situation due to threats of violence, or simply the lack of access to legal protections or resources. The Chinese government has taken steps to combat the issue, such as launching national anti-trafficking campaigns, creating a hotline for victims, and providing funding for organizations that tackle the issue. However, much more needs to be done in order to effectively address the problem. For instance, more needs to be done to prevent exploitation and ensure that traffickers receive the punishment they deserve. Additionally, the government needs to create better legal frameworks and access to resources for victims, in order to help them heal and reintegrate into society. Number 3. Nigeria. Nigeria is one of the countries in the world with the highest number of reported cases of human trafficking. According to the International Labour Organization, ILO, Nigeria has a long history of trafficking in persons. This is due to the large population of vulnerable individuals in the country, including the high number of internally displaced persons, refugees, and migrants. Traffickers in Nigeria often target rural and marginalized communities, often exploiting children and women. Traffickers also coerce people into forced labor and sex trafficking, including in oil-rich Niger Delta regions and other parts of the country. The ILO reported that the majority of trafficking in Nigeria is internal and victims are often trafficked to urban areas for labor exploitation such as domestic work and street vending. Women and girls are also trafficked for forced marriage and sex work, including for commercial sexual exploitation in the Middle East. The Nigerian government has taken steps to address human trafficking, including establishing a national agency for the prohibition of trafficking in persons and other related matters in 2015. Number 4. Russia. Russia is one of the countries with the most human trafficking, both domestically and internationally. Russia is a major source, transit, and destination country for both men and women who are victims of trafficking. Russia is a source country for victims of forced labor and sexual exploitation, often trafficked to the Middle East, Europe, and other parts of Asia. Russia is also a transit country for victims trafficked from other countries in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, as well as North Korea, to other countries in Europe, the Middle East, and North America. Additionally, Russia's domestic trafficking problem is significant, with victims trafficked within the country for commercial sexual exploitation and forced labor. The majority of victims are women, girls, and sometimes boys who are forced into labor in the prostitution and sex industries. Number 5. India. Human trafficking in India is a major issue, with an estimated 8 million victims, making it one of the countries with the most victims of human trafficking in the world. The majority of those trafficked are women and children who are sold into forced labor, domestic servitude, or sex slavery. Traffickers often target vulnerable people, including those in poverty, those living in conflict zones, and those facing discrimination. Traffickers use a variety of means to recruit victims, such as false job offers, fraudulent marriages, and even kidnapping. In India, human trafficking is often linked to organized crime, and corrupt officials often turn a blind eye to the crime. The Indian government has recently taken steps to address the issue, including passing a comprehensive anti-trafficking law in 2018 and establishing a National Anti-Trafficking Bureau in 2020. However, the prevalence of human trafficking remains a major issue in India and requires further attention and resources. Number 6. United States. The United States is one of the countries with the highest rate of human trafficking, with the National Human Trafficking Hotline reporting that it had received more than 35,000 cases of reported human trafficking since 2007. Human trafficking in the United States involves both sex and labor trafficking, with victims coming from all around the world. Victims of sex trafficking often come from Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. In terms of labor trafficking, Mexico and Central America are common countries of origin for victims in the U.S. Furthermore, U.S. citizens are also victims of trafficking, especially those who are homeless, have a history of childhood abuse, or are part of the LGBT community. The U.S. government has made significant efforts to combat human trafficking, including passing the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which provides a comprehensive framework for prosecuting traffickers, protecting victims, and preventing future trafficking. Number 7. Philippines. The Philippines has been identified as having one of the highest levels of human trafficking in the world. According to the United Nations, the country is a major source, transit, and destination country for human trafficking. Many Filipino women and children, as well as a growing number of men and transgender people, are victims of forced labor and sex trafficking in the Philippines and abroad. The majority of victims trafficked in the Philippines are subjected to sexual exploitation. This includes prostitution, pornography, stripping, and live streaming. Many of the victims are children who are forced into the commercial sex industry. Victims are often lured with promises of jobs or marriage, but find themselves in abusive and exploitative situations. The government has taken steps to combat human trafficking in the Philippines, but the problem continues to persist. The Philippines has ratified several international conventions that are aimed at protecting vulnerable populations and prosecuting traffickers. The government has also set up government bodies and organizations to address the issue of human trafficking in the country. Despite these efforts, more needs to be done to combat human trafficking in the Philippines. Number 8. Mexico. Mexico is one of the top countries with the most human trafficking in the world. Mexico is a source, transit, and destination country for victims of human trafficking, with the majority of Mexico's victims being subjected to labor trafficking. Mexico is a popular destination for victims of sex trafficking due to its close proximity to the United States, and the ease of crossing the US-Mexico border. Mexico's economically disadvantaged populations, including those in rural areas or indigenous communities, are especially vulnerable to human trafficking. The majority of victims in Mexico are recruited from low-income families, lured with false promises of good jobs and higher wages. Mexico is also trying to combat child labor by focusing on laws and public awareness campaigns. In 2019, Mexico passed a new law that increases penalties for human trafficking and provides greater protection for victims. The Mexican government is also working to reduce the demand for human trafficking by increasing public awareness and focusing on prevention. Number 9. Colombia. Colombia has a long history of human trafficking and has been identified as both a source and a destination country for victims of trafficking. It is estimated that there are between 10,000 and 20,000 victims of human trafficking in the country each year, many of whom are children and adolescents. Victims of trafficking in Colombia are often lured into the country with false promises of employment, and then forced into labor or sexual exploitation. In addition, the country also experiences significant levels of internal trafficking. Victims of internal trafficking are often trafficked for forced labor or domestic servitude within the country. To address the problem of human trafficking in Colombia, the government has established a national plan to combat trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. This plan includes a number of initiatives, such as public awareness campaigns, the development of anti-trafficking legislation, and the strengthening of law enforcement and victim protection measures. Number 10. Ecuador. Human trafficking is a pervasive problem in Ecuador. The country serves as a source, transit, and destination for people trafficked for labor and sexual exploitation, including women and children. The majority of trafficking in Ecuador involves the movement of Ecuadorians within the country, although there is also a significant number of people trafficked from Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru into Ecuador. Traffickers often recruit their victims through false offers of employment, with promises of lucrative wages and better living conditions. The most vulnerable populations affected by trafficking in Ecuador include indigenous people, migrants, and women and children living in poverty. Victims who are trafficked for labor exploitation are usually forced to work in the domestic service, construction, and agricultural sectors, while those trafficked for sexual exploitation are often forced into prostitution or pornography. The Ecuadorian government has taken steps to address the issue of human trafficking, including passing legislation in 2017 to strengthen punishments for traffickers. Thanks for joining me in today's episode of Curiosities Around the World, exploring the countries with the most human trafficking. We hope you learned something new about these issues, and are inspired to help combat human trafficking. Remember to like and subscribe for more curious content like this. Until next time, keep exploring.